Thank you very much. Can everybody hear? I mean, it sounds boomingly loud to me, but
Good, keep on.
hope that's all right. This is wonderful to be able to talk to you, Tom. And I just highly recommend this extraordinary book because it goes through such wonderful examples of the interface between science and the arts around this mysterious question of creativity, which I think your book goes a long way to solving in terms of the mystery and unfolding it. The first thing I wanted to ask you about actually is what motivated you to write this book in the first place?
It's a super question. By the way, I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking with Kirsten here because someone I've wanted to have a chat to for quite some time with her background on creativity and theatre studies. It's unusual that a first conversation between people actually happens in public rather than private, but here we go. So it doesn't matter, you can say what you want, but we're going to get on with it here. But there will be a chance, maybe, for you to ask some questions towards the end. But, I'm sure anyone here who's written a book, as I'm sure this is Oxford, almost all of you have, or will soon, you use a certain amount of energy, and that energy typically often comes from anger or disquiet or turbulence. And one of the lovely things about my job as a physicist, but who's interested in lots of other things, too many things, is I love, and also education. So I currently chair the Education Committee of the Royal Society, which is a huge privilege. I go into schools, support teachers, and it gets me into schools. And I love going to schools, and I love particularly running days on science and art, science and history. As I mentioned, I do stuff on science and theology, and those are lovely, general studies days, and interacting with really bright pupils. All pupils are bright, and I love their ideas. But as you probably know, we have this ridiculously narrow post-16 education system in this country. We're the only G20 country in which it is possible after the age of 16 to drop study of your own language, in which it's possible to drop any engagement with science, just as you're becoming adult and critical. I just think that's wrong. Anyway, so I would love sometimes to ask the really bright pupils, you soon get the idea of how they're engaging. I don't blame you. I'm not going to criticise anyone for what subjects they've chosen. I'd just like to know who's not doing any science history. Why wouldn't you choose French, English and history? I mean, wonderful subjects. But tell me why you didn't. Because I could tell from your questions, you can study anything you wanted. You could have carried anything. Why not science? And the really bright ones do not say, as many do, I'm just not very good at it. Some say that. They don't say that because they know that's not true. They say, I never saw room. I didn't see any room for creativity or for my own imagination or my own critical thinking in science. And it's like a knife. It's like a knife. What have we done? What have we done to portray this extraordinary human gift to reimagine the universe that's been going on for centuries as some sort of protocol or method? And so I had to write a book explaining why science is creative. And of course, because I'm a scientist, as well as talking with all the scientists about, tell me your creative stories, which is in here, I have to do a control experiment, don't I? I have to do a control experiment, at least I can get that method right. So which is why I've also spoke to artists, poets, painters, musicians, composers about their creative processes, and the shock I got when I started hearing all these narratives. So that was really the reason. Then it pitched me into this series of conversations, which then pitched me into a whole history of background reading too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, it's really rich. Not just in terms of crossing disciplines, so looking at poetry, the novel, medieval literature and thought generally, but actually incredibly trans-historical. I mean, you range across virtually all periods of literature and science.
And you get some free colour, but OUP allowed me some colour plates too, so that's thank you, OUP.
Exactly. I guess I want to flip things. I mean, I made this long list. Hold it up. Look at that list of terms that come up frequently in Tom's book. I will give you an example. So innovation, imagination, curiosity, patterns of thought, collaboration, so on. I'll come back to these, but I thought maybe we could start with a term that I don't find often in your book, and which is originality. And I wondered if you could speak about that. Well, about maybe, what role do you fancy that has?
It's not the index.
Well, maybe I haven't been reading about it.
The only O is Ben Okri, as in Ben Okri. Well, it's a nice substitute for originality, of course, but...
what do you think about originality?
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. how clever to spot the dog that didn't bark. Why don't I write about it? It's interesting because I don't like that. It's true, I don't like the word. I don't like the word. And you've caught me not talking about originality. And okay, so let me tell you why. I didn't know that I had if you'd asked me, had I talked about originality, I said, of course I have. I can see it somewhere. But it isn't. How interesting. I think it's because originality is a misleading path. I think it's over-egged. We talk about it too much. We fetishize it. We over-stress the original. And what I find, and we do this in science, creativity is often defined in terms of originality. But when you actually look at the creative process, honestly, it's very difficult to spot origins. There are all sorts of confluences and fluxes and sparks and combinations, the alchemy of ideas. This happens in science all the time. Where does an idea originate? It's hard to say. Even Newton, said, didn't he? We see further because we stand in the shoulders of giants. We were talking about some of the medieval scientists like Robert Grosseteste and Robert Bacon that give this huge scientific inheritance, pre-modern inheritance, that we don't often recognise in our public narrative about science, but we really should do. I do have some, this is why I love the personal stories here. I put in a few very individual ones around scientific ideas and a few of the ways in which I've worked with collaborators and have not uncommonly encountered experiences where the origin of an idea is neither one of us nor the other, but somewhere in the air between the two, but owes huge amounts to previous reading, previous conversations, previous ideas, and not just within science, outside. So maybe I don't talk about originality because I wanted in some way to say apophatically that's will-o'-the-wisp. It's don't look here, don't look to originality. You may well be gifted with the focal point, the critical point in the origin of a new idea, and that's what we live. Scientists, like any creative act, we live for these moments, don't we? But that's not the same as being original because one owes so much.
So you uncouple originality from creativity,
very much
which is
so.
very liberating,
Yes.
Because it also is more democratic. You can say all of us can be creative.
Yes.
Do you believe that firmly, that
Yes.
everybody has that capacity?
It's one of the things that makes a human.
But what does it take then to bring that out?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Towards the end of the book, because I reflect a little bit theologically, actually, don't I, on the fact that everyone is creative. Creativity is one of the great human attributes. We are creative, and so the reason I bring theology into the picture is not necessarily from a confessional point of view. I often say that every university should have a department of theology in their humanities faculties because it's the discipline that has retained a critical tool to analyse certain human attributes, desires, and processes, like creativity and like meaning, like purpose. So I find it very useful for that. And after all, it contains some of the deepest narratives, the deepest working out what it means to be human. So the narrative that finds itself in describing human beings as being made in the image of the creator, if you put that equation together, whatever you believe confessionally about that sits bringing the new into being at the centre of what it means to be human. And I think all people do that. There are quotidian little trivial moments where we need to be creative. I don't want to over-egg the C word either, but yes, I think it's very democratic.
Well, one of the things that Tom talks about in the book is that delicate network that we often aren't even conscious we're in of people, ideas that help us to be creative. So the conversations that you relate when scientists have a problem and they are working away at it, and it relies on a team. It's not just a single individual, but I think I come back to that idea of problem solving, and I wonder if we could tease out, okay, you've got a novelist writing a novel, a painter working on a painting, but nothing was there before. They're creating that from nothing. But what about the scientist who is solving a problem? What is the difference? Is there a difference?
Yeah. Well, because it's wonderful, and I don't. By the time I got myself halfway through the project, I realised, oh, now I've got to be careful here, because these narratives are looking so similar. I don't want to slip into an easy naivety and say, oh, well, it's all the same. You know, painting a picture is the same as investigation in chemistry or astronomy. Of course it isn't. But neither is it the same from writing a play and performing it either. So, in fact, what I would say is the differences in the creative narrative within the humanities and arts and within the sciences are just as large. They are the same order as the differences in creativity between artistic and scientific processes. So for example, the book I thought I was going to write wouldn't let itself be written. I'm sure, again, you've all had this experience. You try and write a book, and what's wonderful about, so you know, it became self-reflexively, of course, writing a book is itself a creative process, and I was running into the same sort of story that I was writing about this desire and imagination within constraint. And the constraint I started to feel was the constraint of the shape of human creativity itself, which was not the shape I thought it was going to be. I thought there was going to be a kind of class of creative processes like the artist and the painter and the poet, which bore similarity to, but were very different from, the class of creative stories and processes and tools and contemplations I was getting from chemists and mathematicians and physicists. And then I'd write about those, and I'd write about these, and then I'd write a nice concluding undergraduate essay chapter, which bridged between the two, and nice books. Can't do it. Cannot do it. It's all far too entangled in that, which is why the structure that came out, there may be many other ways of doing this, was to identify 3 different modes of creativity, that each of which bridge between artistic communities and scientific communities, which are the visual mode, thinking with pictures, creating with pictures, the textual mode, thinking with words, building with words, and then that third extraordinary transcendent place, you know, when you have no pictures and you have no words, and you think, well, now there's a vacuum, there's nothing. In that transcendent space appear both music and mathematics, which we know mean something, but what do they mean? And it's beautiful. So that I don't know, that probably doesn't quite answer your question, but it gives a bit of structure to the space.
No, it does, and I think it's important to mention that these very clear areas that you map out, and you do distinguish amongst them, even while you see the way, you show the ways in which they relate to each other. But what you've also outlined, I think, there is the material, the substance, the sense of what the working, the physical things that the creative person is working with. So you have a playwright working, or a theater maker working with the physical stuff of the space and props, etc., as well as actors.
Yeah.
You have in music, you have what do you have to work with in each domain? It's often quite material, and it's not just some sphere, some very spiritual domain of ideas. And I wonder how often, also with sciences, it comes down to the knowledge of those materials, familiarity with those materials, and knowing them in and out, and knowing what they're capable of, but also being able to see them differently. Why don't we do this so the audience is sitting there instead of there? Or, and just adjustments like that can be really creative.
Well, how else might the world be? I mean, of course, the reason that science, just to lay a bit of groundwork, the reason that science has to be creative is that the scientific process is inductive, not deductive. So we cannot deduce what the structure of the world is and how it works from what we see in experiment. We have to induce it and then ask, is this making sense? And so we're experimenting in the broadest sense of the word all the time. But your materiality is one that actually brings the sciences and the arts closer together, I would say, rather than apart. So this is one thing I found from my stories. You see, I found that one of the reasons that people, that we generally have a very different view of what it is like to do science, or what it is like to do art, is because artists tend to be very free with the stories of the muse, if I can put it that way, their experience of inspiration. It kind of goes with the artistic temperament, whatever that is, and being, because it doesn't have a method. Now, of course, science is supposed to have a method. It's a lie. There is no scientific method. Just whispering to make sure people don't hear that, but it needs to be true. It's just a complete fabrication. And as all the scientists here will know, and they're all smiling, I can tell immediately where the scientists are, because let the cat out of the bag now. But there isn't, because it's inductive, you see. No, of course there is a method for part of science. When you've got your hypothesis and had your idea, there's a sort of method for how you might test it. But that's the trivial, that's the workshop. It can be hard work. But where these ideas come from, and even Popper, and very people don't read Popper carefully. If you read Karl Popper, the kind of the arch magister of the scientific method at the 20th century philosophy of science, Karl Popper says, I know that the most important part of science is where ideas come from, but I have nothing to say about that because there's no method. And it's all done in a sentence. And then there follows 759 pages, because there's so many words, of conjectures and refutations. But he knows that it's kind of the second order stuff. At the same time, scientists don't like, therefore, talking about where the ideas come from. But after a glass or two of wine, they will look over both shoulders and they'll say, well, it's funny you should ask me that question. But similarly, I discovered that artists are a little bit quiet about part of their story, which is the working with the materiality, the workshop phase, the experiment phase. How many artists are honest enough about how many times they scrape the oil paint off the canvas because it's still not working? I've got to try something else. Ben Ockrey, who was the O in the index, I referenced from a wonderful event at Torch right here a few years ago, which gave inspiration for this, where we had, it was all about mathematics and poetry. So Marcus Soto was there waving his thing and his stuff on poetry, and we had Roger Penrose talking about theoretical physics, and we had Ben Ockrey. And at one point I could see Roger Penrose getting more and more agitated. And eventually he said, look, it's all nonsense, this, some words to this effect. The point about science is it's got to be right. You novelists and playwrights, you can make your characters do whatever you want. You've got perfect freedom and no constraints at all. At which point Ben Ockrey said, Professor Penrose, do you know how many times I had to redraft my last novel before the characters were behaving according to their character? The answer was 24, by the way, if I remember correctly. So, and I discovered that, without saying that the artistic process is the same, nonetheless, because we are mute on orthogonal aspects of the creative process, we artificially distort the presentation of our creative processes and make them doubly different. And if we talk more about, if scientists were to talk more about inspiration, artists would talk a little bit more about the experimental workshop, which is the materiality, the recalcitrance of the material world, then I think we learn together.
That's true. I mean, this is going to be, it sounds like I've been reading your work.
A novel,
That's great.
I love it.
Great. Is that a compliment?
Yes, definitely.
You're going to think I've been reading it with the view to finding what's not in it, and that's not true.
Oh, please,
but
I'm enjoying it.
And I just realized that another word that doesn't occur is failure. And I was thinking, is your idea of creativity always with, you can measure it by its success, its successful outcome, because I'm thinking about examples from theater where, especially the famous thing that Samuel Beckett said, when his actors said, oh no, what do we do? It's been a failure. And he said, well, fail again, fail better.
Feel better.
And that's so famous. But actually, Beckett is relevant in so many ways to what you write about, because, for example, on the idea that you can turn success and failure on their heads, and really the key thing is the creativity, but also the collaboration, but also the idea that, especially within this issue of materiality and the stuff that you use to create, he consistently, and the actors loved him for this, he consistently sought ways to reduce the materials they had at their disposal. So there's a famous play called Not I, in which he just has a mouth. A mouth is speaking the whole 10 minutes of this short play. And the actor she had to be strapped to a board, and the audience couldn't see this, but behind a big black cloth strapped to a board. It was incredibly painful, and all you could see was the mouth with this little square cut out. I mean, and the strange thing is the actors kept coming back for more of that. They absolutely loved that he would strap them to boards, put them in big urns, inhibit them, constrain them. And a word you do use a lot is this idea of constraint
yes.
as something that enables creativity.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question, actually, because it's about something you wrote in your book about science and theatre, but I will just say, although I don't, perhaps I don't use the word failure itself very much, I do write about failure, because what I wanted to get from, I asked the scientists deliberately to tell me in your creative stories, don't give me the polished final version. That is not what I'm after. That's what we're expected, that's what we're promoted on. But that's what we get used to selling. Please tell me the true story. Tell me the ups and downs. Tell me the failures and the cul-de-sac. The best book on failure in science is written by a man called Stuart Firestein, who is absolutely a lovely guy. He's retired now. He was professor of biology at Columbia University. He's written two of the best books on science I've ever read for lay understanding of how science really works. And one is called Ignorance, and one is called Failure. And he says these are the two most important ingredients in science, and he's absolutely right. So I'm sorry I've not made that clear. I'll have to redraft the whole thing now and write more about failure, because failure is so essential to it's the ramification, it's all the funny things you try. Well, maybe, but what I do love, I write about scientific models that have ultimately failed. So my favourite scientific model is what C.S. Lewis called the discarded image, the great medieval world model, which is what's on the front cover. On the front cover is a picture of an art installation by Alexander Carr of the seven celestial spheres. And the geocentric universe with its elemental spheres of turbulence and verticality and imperfection and its glorious celestial sphericity rotating around us at this ridiculous rate. I mean, it's completely wrong. It's utterly wrong, but it is stunningly beautiful. Read what Dante says about it so scientifically. And what is more, we tend to look down at the history of science through the wrong end of our telescopes all the time. It's a weak view of science. And I wish more scientists would recognise the genius of these past natural philosophers who looked at the sky. One of my favourite moments, we mentioned we have this project on medieval science, and one of the texts we've been looking at is Robert Grosseteste de Luca, probably written here in Oxford actually in the 1220s, and he imagines a physical theory for how this extraordinary universe with its concentric spheres was formed. Because he, as a Christian scholar, by the way, needs to use Aristotelian physics against Aristotle, who thought the universe couldn't have a beginning. So that's why he's doing it. But he imagines this spark of light and the universe expanding in a giant sphere out from this Big Bang, and the crystalline spheres sort of coming into being through refraction. It's a very gorgeous piece of physics, which we've used modern cosmologists to help us understand from the text, because it's so mathematical. And what these people now say is huge respect to this thinker. And because before you have a telescope, and not just anything, a really big telescope, you should be working with a geocentric model of the world, because that's the simpler, most natural version. You only work with that until the model tells you through its constraints things are going wrong. So, and I suppose there is a massive, quote, failure in here, but it's the most successful and beautiful failure there ever was in science. But the question I want to ask you is on this simplicity thing. Because let's take science and theatre. I know I'm not supposed to be talking about her, but I do want to get this in. And now, science and theatre, just a wonderful book about scientific plays. And you point out that the genre, or the multiple genres of plays in science, have this stage simplicity. Copenhagen, 3 characters, 2 chairs and a table. That's about it, and sometimes sparser still. But you also say that scientific writing scientific plays tend to demand more imagination. It's the other side of the same coin, from the audience. Now, do you think that's because science itself has this great, naked, creative kernel to it that's being reflected in the theatre, or is it for some other reason? The simplicity and the demand of creativity.
I mean, That's a great question. It's really interesting. I think that part of the reason why theater and science have this really fruitful interchange is actually not because theater is being used to teach the science. And I think that's where audiences actually, and I'd really be curious to know about your own experience, but if you've gone to a play that engages with science, first of all, has it mattered very much whether you've understood the science completely? Have you balked if you started to feel you were being taught, that you were sort of, the science was being smuggled in via the theater? And these are the kinds of things that have been an issue if you, on the one hand, have a playwright approaching science, as in you're first a playwright and then you use science, or if you're a scientist who is using theater. There is a difference. Yeah. And I would bounce it back in a way and say, what kind of thing is going on there when you have these different domains borrowing from each other and you have the problem of expertise and expert knowledge. And it's something that you, sometimes in your book, you know, it's just so clear, you don't need to spell it out, that the scientist, when you talk about polymers, I'm lost, Tom. You know, I'm not able.
Failed. There's a failure.
It's my own failing. But it's that feeling that I cannot keep up with you completely because you will inevitably have to speak expert language. Yeah. Whereas when you're talking about Henry James or Zola, most of us can keep up. So
it's because I'm in the sixth form on that level. Yeah, that's why. Yeah.
Well, no, but I just thought, what kind of challenges did you face when you were going to speak about such a wide range of material and such different domains?
Yes. Well, the other thing. Well, I suppose it's just because I had such a lucky, fortunate career, even from school. So I mentioned although I was at school, ordinary school, did science A levels, and those are the back in the days where if you were me, you had to do double maths, physics, and chemistry, and that's and I did. I don't regret that. But we had a fabulous French teacher who said, a man called David Van, and I'd love to meet him again. I don't know if he's still alive, but he was determined. That was if you were good at languages, and I could do them to you. There were a few of us who sat French O level, the old GCSE a year early, and he was incensed that. Scientific linguists were not able to study language at sixth form level. So he said, look, I'm going to get an A-level class going for these girls and boys a year early. They'll sit A-level French in there. After 1 year of sixth form, you science teachers can have them all to yourself. There won't be any interference from the French with your chemistry. They'll get, Oxbridge nonsense, and it'll be all right. And David was also passionate about the existentialists, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and so I read L'Étranger. So I got this and when it comes to, just imagine, when you're 17 and 18, it's intellectual equivalent to smoking G10 behind the bike shed, reading Camus, reading L'Étranger, and then going into your physics. It was kind of cool, but it was also, I realised that knowledge, I could feel the connections. I'm just so grateful for that. And so in my academic life, I've also been very, very fortunate to have opportunities to work with across the sciences and the humanities. And I just think that we live in a very fragmented world. And I actually think I've always thought universities are really vital, very deeply important. And this academic stuff isn't nice to have. It's essential. And one of the problems is that we reflect in our academic landscape the damaging fragmentation which is out there in the world. And I think we just start healing ourselves at home. So I'm just passionately engaged in the sort of unity of the academic project, which isn't so much the kind of naive unity of knowledge. David Lowenthal has written a book about that, which blows a strong warning trumpet about the unity of knowledge. But actually, I'm not sure entirely I agree with him, because at its base, I think all knowledge is connected.
Well, you've got something in your book where you say, quote, reading Shakespeare can contribute to the solution of scientific puzzles.
Yes.
And of course I want to ask you about that.
Yes.
And what you mean. And
okay, so this is what I mean. And I think there needs to be this also opened up is this huge unsolved dichotomy and dance between the conscious parts of our creative experience and the subconscious parts. So I've also read, I've quoted Ian McGilchrist quite a bit here, and the Master and Emissary, and all that about left brain, right brain, not because it's science and and art's not, we know that's not true at all, creative, but it's more to do with language and closeness and division and analysis and holism and putting it together and the big picture. So the reason that I think reading Shakespeare and looking at art and listening to music can help you with science and vice versa is because I think all these things connect not just consciously but probably more powerfully subconsciously. And so what I'm fascinated by, it's an unsolved thing, I'm just fascinated by the experience of the aha moment, which we've all had in, how we go, or everything from what are we going to give little, Sarah for Christmas, can't think, suddenly an idea comes, all the way to how do we explain these discrete spectra, Mr. Heisenberg, of light coming from atoms, and then Heisenberg gets almost ill, and then he's on holiday on the cliff top on this island off the coast of Denmark, and he's been in working in a lab in the scene of mathematical notation, and he gets all weird, and the numbers and indices dance in his head, and then he suddenly thinks maybe the right way to think about momentum is to think about it's as an operator, not as a number. It's something we do to something, not something that reports back. What's the mathematics of that? It's a matrix. So everything connects. Everything connects. And he was a great musician and theatre goer too. So, but if I had a fiver for everyone who'd said to me, and then I was getting off a bus when. Actually, famously, Penrose says this, the black hole singularity theorem, and there are other many. And I thought, what are these moments, or on a run, or in the shower, what are these moments when, and we know what it isn't. It's not an angel whispering in your ear. It's not the muse descending in diaphanous, veils and singing in as Shakespeare would have it in the 100th sonnet. But it's your own. I mean, there are many other people's voices there, it's not solitary, but they've all been roiling around in this moment of subconscious. And when do we listen to our subconscious? Almost never. Almost never. So this is amateur psychology, by the way, huge health warning, I don't know what I'm talking about here. Almost never, because we're all doing this Bayesian thing. Where are we? We're not at Bookshop. Why? We've got those lights up there, the shop lights, which these places, chairs, they've books, all those strange things in the bookshop. And then, so all your mind is giving you bookshop interpretations right now. And when you go out into the street, it'll be bus, grace count, wind, funny shop selling coffee in the street. Why? Oh, because it's the festival. And then you've got all this thing being thrown at you. And there's one little moment when you're in neither of those, interpret, please, modes, when you walk through the door. As you walk through this liminal space, your mind, almost, your Bayesian mind literally has to change gear. And I have a feeling that it's these moments of quietness when your brain isn't throwing its interpretive background and stuff at itself all the time, is when that wonderful structure of subconscious reimagining, reconstructing, Lego, child's play, says, oh, I've got an idea.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just said actually chimes a lot with what we read more and more about. This is going to sound familiar, kids are using the phones too much, and one argument there is that they need more downtime, and that actually boredom is great for creativity. Being bored generates ideas and generates creative projects and thinking.
Because you set your mind in neutral. Is there anything written on that? Is there research on boredom?
They're just, again, popular psychology of it. Or Radio 4. I've been hearing a lot about that. I'm sure this is familiar to you as well, that this is a concern people are talking about in terms of allowing more space for just not doing anything. Or the repetitive movements of, say, walking the dog or going swimming or doing something that you don't have to think about doing can actually cause moments of imaginative leaps. You do use the term imaginative leap sometimes. Yeah. I know we need to open up, we'd love to open up to questions. I have one more question for Tom,
a short answer.
Which is actually about when you talked about Heisenberg becoming ill with the stress and excitement and just being outside of himself, almost, unbelievably so, when he was coming up with a solution, an idea, being creative. And I thought there's a big part of your book that's about the emotion of science, and that's actually, you argue that gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of idea of dryness everybody's so sensible and scientists don't have emotion.
Yeah.
And actually, you quote a scientist who said, no, scientists must never feel, this mustn't enter in. I forget.
Yeah, he lives quite near here, actually. That was our friend Richard Dawkins, I'm afraid.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But that idea that actually you encourage that to be considered as part of the creative process in science.
Well, it's not that I encourage it, I just find it. All these stories, I realised that there was you couldn't with a scalpel, you couldn't divide off the cognitive from the affective. We've got the idea that, with these stereotypes of people, and again, it's part of this two cultures nonsense, of the creative artist as being driven by the passions and emotions, and the scientist being coldly cognitive and analytical, and, very hard to get a giggle out of them, and so forth. And it's just not true. I'm sure, but it's just not true, because when I hear these stories, I hear emotions at every turn, and in fact, so this what I call the narrative of human creativity. In fact, I had so much commonality from the artists, and poets, and scientists, and mathematicians, and so forth, engineers. So much commonality. I actually decided that Christopher Booker, in his 7 great plots, had missed one out. The idea is that all great narratives, all great novels fall into the great romance, boy meets girl, everything's lovely, the great tragedy, boy meets girl, it all turns out awful, and the great quest, the battle of good and evil, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all that. And there are 7. No, there's another one. It's this narrative of bringing something to be, something into the world that was never there before. It's the narrative of creativity, and it has this sort of shape of desire, and it's got, that story has emotion and cognition woven together super, super tightly. So the first thing is vision. You see some vague idea. It could be a painting, it could be a poem, it could be an idea, it could be a scientific puzzle, it could be, and then you desperately, that immediately elicits desire. It's no apologies for using the deep word. It's really almost, it's eros of desire, almost to do this thing. And without that energy, you could never get there, because then comes the emotions of despair and frustration when you fail, the failure. And so I do talk about failure because it's in that context. And then all other emotions come. And this is what drove me to these great medievalists, because the last time, I look back in the philosophy of creativity and honestly found the last century in which people had spent enough time contemplating, reflecting deeply, philosophically, scientifically, with the liberal arts, theologically for sure, on that process was the 13th century. And you have this extraordinary medieval insight of the duality of what they call, I have to use the Latin, affectus and aspectus. The affectus is what, there are kind of, pardon the metaphor, but coordinate rotation of affect and cognition. Aspectus is sort of sight and insight, and affectus is emotion. And someone like Grosseteste will introduce his treatise on the liberal arts by saying, look, our emotions and our thought and our insight, our mind's eye, drive each other to everything that we do. So it's sight, feeling, and action. And that's the creative process, whether it's in mathematics or music. And so that's something else we need to be much more honest about, and that's something else about the deeply human aspect of creativity. If I make just one little story, one tiny story. So the chapter 4 on the entangled story of the novel and the experimental method, which we haven't touched on, but it's an extraordinary story. I did some research at the University of Notre Dame in Illinois as part of their Institute for Advanced Studies, and an IES is a wonderful place. You go there for a month or two, and there's one of you, if you're a physicist, and there's an artist and an art historian, and a theologian and a chemist and a film studies, and it's wonderful. And you have to go, the only rule is you have to give X seminars, and you have to go to everyone else's seminar. Absolutely must. And you have to be involved in the discussion right across the disciplines. Great. And I was at an early stage, and I just managed to tease out this story of creativity and how the emotions and the brain the cognition is both involved right across the spectrum. And there was a historian there called Patrick, and Patrick always asked the best questions. And so I was really looking forward to Patrick's question. And it didn't come. And I was absolutely devastated. I thought, oh right, I failed. I've failed to communicate. I've been talking about polymers all the time. No one's understood a word. I've used the jargon. I've poor them, dull. I'll scrap the book and do something else. And anyway, I was a bit low. Next morning, coffee time, knock on the door. It's Patrick. I'm at my office in the IS. He says, Tom, I just wanted to call by and say thank you for your seminar yesterday, which made me think really hard. Oh, in fact, I'm really sorry I didn't join in because I didn't join in just because I was maybe think so hard and reflect on my own experience. God, Patrick, tell me more. What's going on? He said, yes. He said, you told me the story of my life as an academic historian. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's what it's like. And I wish people told about. Because he said, I've honestly been worried about how emotional I get about my history. I'm just an academic historian, and when things are going right and I've worked out why this king wrote that letter to this other person, I get so excited. And when I can't work out what was going on, or and everything I try doesn't work, it doesn't fit, I get, honestly, depressed and dark. And I thought I was bipolar, but you've told me it's just everyone does this. So we should be more honest as academics, that we too even ask, secondary, units in the REM type of, commentators on art and science. We too are being creative all the time, and we too go through this process of creativity, and it's emotional. It's our emotional ride. So I thought I'd tell you that story, because it's a lovely story.
Great way to end, actually. Yeah.
So Thomas Kuhn, famously, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that's what you think about, Sarah, isn't it? And actually, it's really be interested to hear what you have to say, Kirsten, about that, and so theatre genres in play as well. Well, again, you probably guess, as in our apophatic way of talking about what we didn't talk about. I like Kuhn, actually, and I always thought this made a huge amount of sense, but I think it's a bit oversimplified, and one of its great problems is that it does overstress the role of the solitary genius breaking out of the paradigm. When you really push what actually happens, it's a lot more complex and collegiate and cooperative than that. Communities tend to move out of paradigms. There's more continuity than shift. So perhaps the great paradigm shift, you see, one reason I love medieval science is there's no doubt that there was a huge shift in scientific understanding from the high medieval to the early modern period. But there's a lot more continuity than the glib scientific coffee table book histories lead us to believe. And Galileo was much more of a medievalist than we lead him to believe. And Rem and Buridan were much more modernist than we give them credit for, and Grosseteste certainly was. He was wide out there. So maybe that's why I didn't. There are paradigm shifts, but I think we need a model of cooperative, communicative paradigm shifts rather than the great individual who bursts the bubble. What about that?
No, I mean, absolutely. I guess I was just thinking about when I was driving here, listening to, on the radio came some Stephen Sondheim. And it made me think, as I always do with Stephen Sondheim, it seems to come out of the blue, it's so unfamiliar, and yet he knew what a musical was. And he had to know what a musical was, what Rodgers and Hammerstein did, etc., in order for him to break out of it. And so is that the sort of thing you're thinking of, that you actually have to know pretty well what came before in order to make a leap to something new? Yeah. So is creativity actually reinvention is one question you might...
Yeah, well, I think sometimes the seed of the new paradigm are often found inside the old, not outside. Mm. So it's a little bit, perhaps the image I have in mind here is a phase transition in science. That sounds very dull, but just boiling a kettle. So phase is just a fancy words for turning liquid into gas. And before, as you put your kettle on, you probably know that you can hear when it's coming to the boil. In fact, long before it comes to the boil, you hear this hiss. Now, I know everyone knows what the hiss is. It's very interesting what the hiss is. The hiss that you get when the kettle starts going shh, before it goes blah, 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 it goes shh, and the shh is because little tiny bits of water boiling right on the hot plate, forming little bubbles of steam, which then immediately rise. But of course, they rise into cold water and they collapse straight away. So it's thousands of those little bits going shh. But what this is, it's little bubbles of the new idea, the gas, forming in the old idea, the liquid. And so I love the way that science works that way And I think that paradigm shifts usually, it's like there's a lovely biblical motif which comes in the book of Job, which is my other book, and there as well, by the way, Faith and Wisdom and Science. But there's, shall I get that one in quickly? Where Job complains that human beings, if they're cut down, they never rise again. Even a tree, if you cut a tree down completely, a new shoot will come from the stump. And I love this image. I love this image of the new shoot rising from the stump of a cut down tree, and that's, I think, what a paradigm shift looks more like. Well, maybe an example of how this works is that we were discussing before a project that I'm involved in York, in collaborating with a colleague of Kirsten's on the science in Bertolt Brecht's plays, and I'm really feeling this. But where I think the way through is, I don't think there are these, Renaissance women and men anymore. We can't be there are books entitled called, is it the last man, unfortunately, the last man who knew everything. Anyway, doesn't matter. But what I think we can be is what I call T-shaped people. So it's vitally important that we have something to bring to the interdisciplinary party. This is what I encourage our students to do, to develop a deep understanding and an experience and acquiescence and deep knowledge of a particular subject. But the silos are just eye-shaped, But if you were to just spend a bit of time growing arms as well, and you end up being T-shaped, and then you have that allows you sufficient valency with other disciplines to know what is their depth, what they bring to the party, and how to communicate with them. And now, that's not cheap. That itself is a massive piece of work, but it is doable. So in this other, for example, the other project, I'm going to Pembroke College in a little while, an hour and a half, to launch volume 1, which is another book launch, of an Oxford, Durham and York-based project on medieval science. On this is where Grosseteste comes from. We've been working on this for 12 years. Latinists, historians, theologians, physicists, mathematicians, engineers, psychologists, historians on Robert Grosseteste's of 20th century Oxford science. And the reason we've needed all these people is because he was someone who knew everything then, but we now need all those disciplines to get perspectives on how his mind worked in context. But when we work together, we read the text together and we communicate each other's insights, we can, with that hard work, bring a totality which is greater than the sum of its parts out of the project. So those are two little illustrations from me about how I think we can both admit you're right about the silos, but turn them into silos to talk to each other.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That I would just add to that the idea of, because I work on theatre and science, just from my perspective, I'm always watching my back thinking, someone's going to discover I don't know everything about the uncertainty principle. You're always feeling inadequate if you not just are trying to deal with one domain, but more than one, sometimes several, not just two. So it's just, you become accustomed to feeling inadequate all the time in terms of your knowledge. And I think that maybe I'm just comforting myself or deluding myself, but that can actually lead to better questions.
Oh, yes.
So because you don't know everything about the physics of Copenhagen, the play by Michael Frayn, for example, you will ask questions that might get more to the heart.
Yes. And the physicists will like that. So that's why interdisciplinary is fabulous, and that's why this rhetoric that young scientists are often advised, or young academics, don't do leave it to when you're McLeish's age, you will do it. Leave it to when you're old. No, you don't need to do that because it's a zero-sum game. It is not true that providing you wisely do this, that the time spent on interdisciplinarity dilutes your creativity within your home discipline. I'm passionately behind this because of this, because you get fresh insights and fresh questions that can form the tree. You could be the paradigm shifters that way. And something that, Kristen, you said about in your book about science and plays, you said there are various genres. There are playwrights that write a book about the plays about science. There are scientists who try to write plays about the science. But you say the more interesting ones are the collaborations. You actually say they're more interesting, and between playwrights and scientists who together do this. And therefore, in a way that I think that's lovely, because they're admitting their own inadequacies. There's a certain humility in this, actually. It's a wonderful academic humility being involved in a interdisciplinary project. But what they can produce together is perhaps deeper or more interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, one of the things that's, just going back to Copenhagen by Michael Frayn, how many people know that play? Okay, well, that, when it was done in Denmark, in Copenhagen, this was really hard for the actors. The director relates this story of how they really struggled, and they were quite, quite worried because there was nothing to hang on to. There's no scenery, for one thing, and there's so much text to memorize. And then the director brought some physicists on board to work with, and he noticed right away that at the end of the day, the actors would go home and say, "Oh, we have a problem," and the physicists would go, "Oh, we have a problem." And it was just that whole different attitude.
Yay, we love them! Bring it on!
Well, that's interesting about Copenhagen, because this is anecdotal, so I can't claim that I've carried out rigorous research, but when I was in the audience, this was when it was first done in New York, I remember at intermission, there were people around going, as the lights came up, it wasn't, "Oh, let's go get a drink." It was actually, "I have no idea what that was about, but it's amazing. It's fascinating." So I think there's a lesson in there for playwrights who think, "Oh, the audience isn't going to understand the science, let's abandon the idea, or let's translate it to make it easy." But actually, audiences really like the difficulty. I know it's a thorny question about, well, which audiences, and I'm aware of that, but certainly in the context of that New York production, and I think elsewhere where it's been done, there's been an excitement around encountering something that might be a bit difficult, but actually is quite exciting. There's an excitement about it.
Right.
And maybe it's about ideas and curiosity and how things work.
I would also say that one shouldn't automatically elide the non-mathematical descriptive or the visual with the trivial, and the mathematical with the deep. I'm aware that physics ultimately requires mathematical language to make it work. And I'm grateful for the years I spent studying mathematics, so I can do it. I can use the maths. And actually, there's a little picture here. Again, so on the chapter on maths and music, I actually point out that I want to explore the role of notation, actually, in creative disciplines that have a notation that one requires an inculcated formation of expertise to understand. And I play a nice game. I say, okay, those of you who understand musical notation, they're going to love the first part of this chapter, perhaps not the second. Those of you who love mathematics, but aren't musicians, are going to find. But But don't worry. Keep with us. Keep with us. Don't just watch the patterns. Watch how the symbols move about. Watch what they begin to mean. So I actually think, both in the light of that and in the light of quite masterly, might call them popular science, but Simon Singh's description of Andrew Wiles's solution of Fermat's theorem, and of course because Einstein said that, he knows, the way Einstein said he did his physics, with pictures or even below pictures with feelings, and it was at a much later stage that he searched for both the mathematics and the words to make those work. If that is true, and we can only take Einstein's word for it, we know how Einstein conceived special relativity, and that's why 12-year-olds get special relativity, as Russell Stannard worked out in his Uncle Albert books, because he dreamed when he was 16 what it would look like if he were a light beam, if he were trying to catch up a light beam. And he imagined that, and just the pictorial, almost visceral experience of that tells you, without any mathematics, that what you thought, the independence you thought that space and time had, they cannot possibly have, because you can't catch a light beam, because light always runs away from you. That was his wonderful insight. There's no maths in there, and actually anyone can get that. So at some level, I do think I'm more optimistic than you, I think perhaps, but with the mutuality that both science and art and other disciplines can get from conversations at a rather deeper level than would be the case if it were true that that hard-won technical, material, manipulative, 10,000 hour stuff is an absolute gateway to depth. I don't think it is.